Yesterday, a client told me it's been 7 months, not 7 days, not 7 weeks, but 7 months. And I still have grief, times when grief hits me like a truck. If you're watching this because someone, maybe even you, has suggested that you should be better by now, or if you're wondering why you still tear up or still struggling, and you still feel like your world is different, I made this video for you. So hi, I'm Sally Wright, and today we're going to be talking about one of the most, I think, damaging myths in our culture, and that is that grief has a timeline, or that grief has an expiration date. So here's what might surprise you. Research shows that most people are still actively grieving 18 to 24 months after losing a parent. So, you know, those 3 days of bereavement time that your work gives you, or the month that people keep asking, and then after that month, no one asks you again. That is this much amount of time that it actually takes to grieve. And some studies suggest that it can take 3 to 5 years to feel like you've actually integrated the loss into your regular life. So if you're 6 months out and still feeling it deeply, you're not behind. You're right where you're supposed to be. You're not broken. You're totally normal. Okay, so let me read you some of the messages that I've received in the past couple of weeks from women who are questioning their own grief timeline. One client says, "It's been 8 months since my mom died. My sister seems totally fine, but I still cry every week. What am I doing wrong?" Another one, potential client, wrote me a couple of weeks ago, and she just said, "My dad died a year ago, and people keep asking if I'm feeling better. I don't know how to tell them that I'm not." And then one of my very first clients, she said, "It's been 6 months, and I can't bring myself to clean out my parents' house." She said, "Everyone in my family has told me to move on and to make this happen. I just don't know why I can't." So can I tell you what's really wrong? Nothing, nothing, absolutely nothing is wrong with these clients of mine or with you. Our culture has created this myth that grief follows a beautiful and neat timeline. We've been told about stages that move you through in order. In fact, I have people come to me all the time. They're like, "What stage am I in?" Our culture has given us these timelines like a year of firsts, and a year of firsts is true, but it doesn't end after a year. It's as if 365 days you get to graduate from grief. And then after 18 months, you're still wondering why. You think you failed. You think there's something wrong with you, but there's not. So here's what actual grief research tells us. It shows us that grief is not linear. It's not predictable. There are parts of it that people tend to feel about the same time, but you're different. Your grief is different. The relationship with your loved one is different. And it doesn't follow anyone else's schedule. It follows your schedule. So one of the leading grief researchers that I've just recently found, his name was Dr. George Bonanno. And he found that there are multiple patterns of grief, multiple patterns of grief. And what he found was the most common one: chronic grief. which he describes as grief that continues at significant levels for years. In his studies of people who had lost spouses, 15 to 20% still experienced intense grief symptoms 2 years later. And these weren't even people with complicated grief. This was totally normal, healthy grieving. So, what does normal grief actually look like? So, I'd like to share with you some of the patterns that research has identified. Okay, pattern one, wave grief. And I think you've probably felt this. I feel this, and my dad died 10 years ago. It's this, there are good days and there are bad days, but there's not a real logical order to them. It's just kind of the phase of the moon or what's happening. Sometimes you'll feel great for a week, and then you'll have 3 rough days in a row. And that's just waves of grief. I had one client describe this pattern to me pretty well. She said, it's like being on an ocean. Sometimes the waves are gentle, sometimes they knock you over, but you're always in the water. I think that's a really beautiful metaphor. So, pattern 2. We call it trigger grief. Trigger grief. And so you're functioning well most of the time, but specific triggers like anniversaries, holidays, songs, smells, pictures bring intense grief episodes. And so this might look like crying every time you pass her favorite restaurant, or tearing up every time someone mentions his name. And this can continue for years. Pattern 3, seasonal grief. It's grief that intensifies during certain times of the year, maybe around a birthday, an anniversary, or even the anniversary of the death, holidays that you shared together. Many people report that months 6 through 18 are actually harder than the first few months because the shock and the numbness has worn off and the reality really begins to set in. Okay, pattern 4, milestone grief. This is where your grief resurfaces at major life events, graduations, births, weddings, promotions, new jobs, starting a business, all these really big things that happen in our life. And it's times when we especially miss having our loved ones there. It's like you might be fine, totally fine, day in and day out. And then as you're planning your daughter's wedding, or you're going to attend your grandchild's first birthday, there's just intense waves of grief, intense emotion because, dad's not there, or mom's not there. And it's hard. And all these patterns can last for years. And here's the real truth. All of these patterns are completely normal. In fact, when I talk to my clients, I hear these patterns often overlapped onto each other. So now I'd like to talk about this 6-month myth, this 6-month mark, because that's when a lot of people start questioning themselves. 6 months might be when casseroles stop coming, or when people stop sending you notes, or when people stop asking how you're doing. And it's almost as if the world expects you to be back to normal. I had a client, we'll call her Rebecca, her name has been changed, who told me at 6 months, my boss said, "I'm glad you're feeling better now." But she said, I wasn't feeling better. I was just a lot better at hiding it. So here's what actually happens right around the 6-month mark. The shock, the numbness is starting to wear off. The reality is beginning to set in. The support is waning, is decreasing. And often the loss feels more intense right around that 6-month mark. Dr. Holly Priggerson's research found that grief symptoms often peak between 6 and 12 months after a loss, not in the first few months. And so if we think about that logically, in the first few months, we're in crisis mode. We're trying to settle everything. We're trying to make sure everything is taken care of, bills and stuff, and just sort of running against all those tasks that have to happen right around a death. Your body is flooded with stress hormones. That fight or flight response is in full gear. And this actually numbs some of the initial pain. You're busy with arrangements and legal issues and immediate needs. But about the 6-month mark, the adrenaline has started to wear off. The busy work, cleaning out closets, taking things where they need to go, having sales, all done. And you're left with the reality of the person you love, and they're never coming back. So if you are 6 months out after the loss of someone you deeply love, and you're feeling worse than you did 3 months ago, you're not going backwards. You're going deeper into the real work of grief. So now I want to share with you part of a client's journey that I had. And I've changed names because I keep all these things confidential, and I've changed circumstances. But I want to tell you about Jennifer's grief journey because I think it perfectly illustrates what normal grief over time really looks like. Jennifer's mom died suddenly of a heart attack. And here's how her grief unfolded. Months 1 through 3, we called it shock and survival. Really, she was numb. Jennifer handled the funeral, dealt with the estate, went back to work even. And everyone said, "You're handling it so well." Months 4 through 6 came, and she described it as the crash. The shock began to wear off, and she started crying daily. And that's when she reached out to me. She just told me, "I can't concentrate at work. I feel like everything's falling apart. I can't remember anything. I don't know what's happening to me." She said, "Everyone tells me I should be better by now." She said, "But I feel worse than I did before. What's wrong with me?" So I worked with her over quite a long period of time. And after we got through that shock period, then she described the roller coaster. That's kind of the metaphor we began to use. She said, "Some days I feel okay. Other days I can barely function." And she said, that is right when the holidays started. And she said, they were devastating. She said, "Christmas nearly broke me. I just didn't know what to do." Months 13 through 18, we looked back on and said, this is kind of the integration. She started having more good days than bad, but the grief was still super present. She could talk about her mom without just bursting into tears. And she began to really understand the triggers, the intense triggers that knocked her over. And then months 19 through 24, so this is right about 2 years out, a year and a half to 2 years out, I labeled this the new normal. As when we reflected upon her journey, she described this part as learning to carry the grief instead of being carried by it. And I really love the way she described that, learning to carry the grief instead of being carried by it. She said, I still miss mom intensely, but it doesn't dominate my daily life. Okay, so it's now been 3 years. And I touch base with her via email, sometimes a phone call. And she said, I still cry about mom sometimes. I still miss her terribly. She said, but I also have built a life that includes my mom's memories without being defined by the pain of the loss. Part of why I wanted to share this story is that Jennifer's timeline isn't unusual. It's typical. And if your timeline looks different, that's typical too. In fact, I want to share with you just a brief story from mine. So, as some of you may know, my dad died about 10 years ago, and he died in November. And I thought I was handling it super well. I had been trained in grief work. I'd been a pastor, I'd gone to seminary, all the things. I knew how to do this, and I knew how to walk with others through it. And so November, and then fast forward to April. April was when I really began to understand just how not okay I was. I had planned an entire conference for the wrong weekend. And it was at that moment that I realized I was not okay and I needed some help. And so at the time, I didn't know about other resources other than just going to see a therapist. And so that's what I did. But I love that, clients like my client Jennifer, she found me and asked me to walk with her. And it's such a joy to get to walk with others over the long haul. Doesn't mean we're doing intense work every single week, but there's sort of this flow that happens of moments when Jennifer would reach out and say, I really want to work with you. And it was just very free form. So if it's been months and you are still having a hard time, trust me, you are very normal. Okay, so now I want to talk about a few factors that can affect your own timeline. So grief timeline is influenced by a lot of things and a lot of factors. And so just think through some of what might be affecting your timeline, because understanding them can really help you stop judging yourself or judging others, and can really help you just sort of settle in to your own grief journey. So factor one, the particular relationship you had with this particular loved one. And what I mean by that, and what I mean by that is if this was your mom that you saw every single day, or that even lived in your house, that's going to be very different than your mom who you saw 3 times a year. Doesn't mean one's better or worse. It just means different. Was the relationship complicated? I have found in my work that the more complicated a relationship is, the more complicated the grief is. That doesn't happen all the time, but it tends to happen. If you were a caregiver, if you were the one doing the bulk of the caregiving, that's going to affect the timeline. So consider these for just a moment. How might you describe the relationship with your loved one who died? And how might you anticipate that affecting your timeline? Okay, so factor 2 is sort of the circumstances of the moment. A sudden loss often creates longer and more complex grief than a loss that goes over a long period of time, and that's kind of expected. Um, a, a loss that is traumatic, and I'm not going to describe what those are, but I think you can imagine, um, often bring about PTSD symptoms that extend the timeline and that complicate it a little bit. And I always recommend that if there has been a traumatic death, to, yes, a client can use me and I will work with them, but I always recommend also having a therapist to do some of that traumatic work together. Okay, factor 3, your own support system. Research tends to indicate that people with stronger support systems often, but not always, often move through grief more smoothly. But even with an incredible support system, a support group, grief takes time. So factor 4, other life stressors. Isn't this going to be general? So like if your work situation is particularly stressful, if you're going through a merger, if you're starting a business, if it's a particularly hard situation at work, that's going to affect your timeline. Relationship issues, financial problems, health concerns, all of these will affect the grief timeline. Likely make it longer for you, but not always. And I want to share just a brief little story. I had a friend whose mom died, and just 2 years later, she was diagnosed with cancer. And so I would touch base with her from time to time. And it was fascinating to me how, because of her mother's death and because of her cancer diagnosis, they actually helped each other. Like it was this really beautiful sort of symbiotic, like she was able to continue to process the grief from her mom while also using her mom's own journey of end of life, to strengthen her own cancer journey. It was really beautiful and not what I expected. I expected it to be the opposite, where it complicated it, but it didn't. It was just a beautiful thing to watch. Okay, factor 5, your own coping style. So some people process emotions quickly and intensely. Others are slow and steady processors. Some people are external processors. Hello. Some people are internal processors. And nothing is good or bad about this. It just indicates how to seek out support and what your timeline might look like. Okay, factor 6, cultural and family messages. So if you grew up in a family or culture that doesn't talk about emotions or doesn't talk about end of life or doesn't talk about anything of that nature, it might take you longer to process grief because you're learning how to do it. You're learning how to grieve. Whereas other families who recognize grief, who recognize end of life, and who talk about them and include the children, there's sort of this pattern of we know how as a family to grieve. So all 6 of these factors interact in complex ways. This is why there's no universal timeline for grief. And this is why I have people reach out to me and say, my mom died 11 years ago, but I really want to use your services. And so it's just fascinating to me that our culture has told us that we only have 3 days or 2 weeks or 3 months or even a year. You get as long as you need. So now you might be wondering, okay, so I'm 2 years out and I'm still feeling this really strongly. So when do I get additional support, or do I need additional support? So as you've heard, people's support systems really enhance and affect how their grief timeline works. But some people don't have support systems. And so when grief happens, that's when they figure out that they really need support. And so before I jump into this, there is a difference between normal long-term grief and complicated grief. And I specialize in normal long-term grief. And I'm always listening for complicated grief. And I will refer that out if it's beyond my scope. Or like I said, I will have a client work with me and with a therapist so that we can do some of that work together from different angles. So here's some of the things you might consider to when you're thinking about, do I need additional help? So these are for when you need to seek therapist, you need to go seek medical help. So if you're having thoughts of hurting yourself, go to the ER immediately. If you're having an inability to function in your daily life for months at a time, seek out a therapist. If you're avoiding everything and anything related to your loved one, seek support. If you have an inability to accept that your loved one is gone, seek support. And if you are using substances, whatever those substances are, to cope with the pain, seek support. Call AA, go to an AA meeting. These are real life things. And so, like I said, I tend to work with women who are dealing with sort of normal long-term grief, not super complicated grief. And so just so you know, if you work with me, I'm listening for these things. I'm always listening and will always make a recommendation if I think that a client needs additional support. And so these symptoms that I just listed might indicate complicated grief, depression, PTSD, or any number of additional potential diagnoses, and would greatly benefit not just from professional treatment like the service, like what I offer, working with you one-on-one, but I mean professional services like healthcare professionals, counselors, psychiatrists, therapists, medical doctors, all that. So, but here's what doesn't require professional help. Crying regularly months later, missing them intensely, having bad days mixed with good days, feeling different than you did before. These are all normal parts of long-term grief. So the difference is functionality. Normal grief allows you to function most of the time, even if you're sad, even if you're heartbroken. Complicated grief, on the other hand, makes basic daily functioning almost non-existent. So, and if you have any questions about this, reach out to me. I'm happy to have a conversation with you and suggest things. I have worked alongside medical health professionals a long time, and so I'm happy to recommend out. Okay, so now let's jump. Let's talk about how to handle others' expectations about your grief timeline. So when people say, aren't you better yet? You might say something along the lines of, I'm healing, but grief doesn't follow a schedule, but I appreciate your concern. Of course, change this language to be your own, but this sort of sentiment of, yeah, grief doesn't follow a schedule and I'm doing my grief work, but thank you for asking. So when people compare your grief to others, you might say, everyone grieves differently. And this is what my grief looks like right now. When people suggest that you're stuck, you might try, I don't think I'm stuck right now. I'm doing a lot of processing. And grief will take as long as it takes. And when you start doubting yourself, remind yourself, in fact, put your hand right here. My grief is normal. My timeline is my own. I'm exactly where I need to be in this process. So yeah, you don't owe anyone a faster timeline, and especially not yourself. You don't owe anyone a neat, clean grief journey. You owe yourself compassion and patience. So as we close, here's what I want you to remember. Grief is not a problem to be solved. It's a process to be lived. It's ultimately about the love that you had for someone else. So your grief at 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, 10 years, it's not a sign that you're doing it wrong. It's a sign that you loved deeply. So the goal isn't to get over your grief or to move on from the loss of your parent. The goal is to learn to carry your love and your loss in a way that allows you to live more fully. Some people integrate their grief within a few months, those lucky people. Others, it takes years. And some carry active grief for decades. All of these are normal, healthy responses to losing someone that mattered so much. So if you're still crying and still struggling and still feeling like your world is different, you're not behind, you're not broken, you're grieving, and grief takes time. And it takes as much time as it takes. So I encourage you to be patient with yourself, be gentle with your own timeline. And remember, the depth of your grief is a testament to the depth of your love. And so if this resonated with you, I would love for you to share this with someone else who might be questioning their own grief timeline. And in the comments, if you want to share, what's one thing you wish people understood about your grief journey? And finally, I want to support you navigating your own grief timeline without judgment or pressure. And so if this sounds helpful to you, check out my Executive Grief Reset program. There's a link in the description. And remember, your grief is valid, no matter how long it lasts. So with that, I'll see you next time.